Okay, it is now 7:30. Welcome, everybody. I see 28 of you online. We'll probably get some more in here over the next several minutes. But I would just like to say welcome to the Hyde Park Book Club, co-sponsored by the Hyde Park Historical Society and Chicago Hyde Park Village. The way the book club usually works, or at least in these strange times, is we've been doing it on Zoom. And if we have a speaker, which we do tonight, Mark Larson, we let the speaker make his presentation or talk to us. And if you have questions for the speaker, please type them in chat. We'll get to them after the presentation is over. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And I, at this point, want to turn it over to Dottie Jeffries, who will make the introductions.
Greetings, everyone. So I'm pleased to introduce Mark Larson, our guest author tonight, and featuring his book, for which he conducted over 300 interviews with theater artists. Mark is an educator who has worked at Evanston Township High School and also in education departments at the Field Museum, Lincoln Park Zoo, and National Louis University. He holds a doctorate in educational leadership. In addition to Ensemble, Mark is the author of 2 books in the field of education and is currently working on the book titled Edward Asner, Actor and Activist, A Collective Portrait. And that should be a really exciting biography to read. And then joining Mark this evening is longtime Chicago theater director and producer of theater and film, Pemon Rami, who will add his thoughts live about a teeming Black theater scene in the 70s, of which he was a part. Rami began his career in 1968 as associate director of the Southside Center for the Performing Arts. He went on to become director of the Kumba Workshop and later artistic managing director of the Lamont Zeno Theater, in addition to other roles he played. He's also an educator and served as director of education and public programs for the Ensemble Museum. In terms of his film production, he's produced the Warner Brothers home video featuring Angela Bassett, Robert Townsend, and Victoria Rowell, titled Of Boys and Men. And more recently, he has co-produced the film 93 Days, which you may have heard of because it's being advertised now, starring Danny Glover, about the first days of the Ebola outbreak in Nigeria. And the film is now available on Netflix. So welcome, Mark and Pemon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before I begin this, let me add that Pemon's film 93 Days really is something to see right now. I mean, when you consider what we're going through, to see another time in another place going through something very similar, it's very, very moving. Masikwa Myers, when I was talking about it before, said, be sure to bring your Kleenex, and I think that's a really good idea. But it's a fine film, and Danny Glover is amazing in it, so congratulations on that, Pemon.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. My book consists of, like Dottie said, lots and lots of interviews, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. And the reason for that is because what I really wanted to do was let the people who lived this history tell their own story. And I was dead set on that. And so there's very little of my own voice in the book, and there'll be little of my voice tonight. So you'll hear clips from some of the people I talked to that had to do with the Hyde Park area. The great thing is we've got Pemon with us, so we don't have to play a clip. I can direct questions to him as we go, so thank you for that. And Michael and Dottie, thanks a lot for this invitation too. It's exciting to be talking to a group in Hyde Park. I so wish, you guys probably feel the same way, I so wish that we could all be in the same space. I'd love to be in Hyde Park right now talking about Hyde Park. That's just not the way it can be. The reason is because the start of my story really begins on the south side of Chicago and in Hyde Park. early on in my conversations, I talked to a woman named Joyce Piven, who was here at the University of Chicago in the early 50s. And she used the word cauldron. This was the cauldron. This is where all these ideas and talents came and mixed at an incredibly fortuitous moment in the history of Chicago. There wasn't a whole lot else going on in Chicago. Pemon's going to address some of what was going on before that. But it became a very, very fertile time. And so that's where I start my book. Because before 1953, it felt like there were more disparate efforts going on. What I was looking for is the start of the movement, when all the different parts sparked each other and ignited each other and supported each other. And it became a movement in that way. But it all began there on the south side of Chicago. In 1953, which was when I was 1 year old, a New York journalist wrote this. His name is A.J. Liebling. It is not considered smart to admit having seen any play in Chicago, because this implies either A, that you haven't seen the real play, or B, that you haven't the airplane fare to New York. That just seemed to be a common point of view across the nation about Chicago. Liebling wrote those articles for a series of articles for the New Yorker, and then he compiled them into a book that he published called The Second City. And we know what ended up happening with that name. Bernie Sahlins, along with Paul Sills and Howard Alk as well, created something called the Second City in 1959, which became kind of an international institution. Whoops, didn't progress. And yeah, there it is, this is the Second City. When I first started the book, I asked the League of Chicago Theaters how many theater companies there are in Chicago. And this was when I first started in 2016. And they sent me this list. And I know you can't read them there, but there's somewhere between 250 theaters that were part of the Chicago scene. We'll talk at the end of the session about where are we now, though? I mean, it's odd to talk about those 250 theaters, because who knows how many of them will remain. Hopefully all of them, but we don't know. But at the time I started writing this, that's what we had, 250 theaters. These are this is a list of some of the people that came from Chicago. Either their careers were spawned here, or they were supported here. At the end of last year, I gave a similar talk in New York at the Harper College for their theater faculty and their students. And I showed this list to them. And I was surprised that they were surprised to recognize a lot of these names and to find out that they came from Chicago. I'm not sure what that's about, but I wish more people knew that Chicago really is the birthplace of so very much. Maybe it's just a New York thing, who knows? This is a page from my book. You'll see that what I tried to do is make this almost like a dialogue, as if all the people I talked to were sitting at the same table. So I would interview, if you see there on the left, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and she talked about Sheldon Patinkin. And then I would call up or meet with Rush Pearson and say, this is what Julia said about Sheldon. What do you think? And then he would give me a response, and that's how this was all put together. And as I said, the luxury we have tonight is, a lot of this that I'm going to share with you is taped, but I'm also going to throw some questions to Pemon too, because he's in the book as well. Now, an important part of this is in the 1930s and 1940s, even before Joyce Piven, who I showed you earlier, even came to the University of Chicago. There was something called the Chicago Black Renaissance here. And I mention this because it has a lasting impact. And it affected what came after it And Pemon, I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about both what that was, but also its impact on you as an artist, because you carry that on, I think.
Sure. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. I'll try to make myself available to Mark. I think he's done an incredible job of putting this book together. And it demonstrates a couple of different things. It demonstrates the separation between the ethnic groups in Chicago and the segregation of the city, especially in its earlier periods, because, our ability to recognize each other has to do with the point in which we stop being invisible. And it's really just kind of interesting as I look through these processes. So I'm going to do this really quickly and move through. All right, so I always try to start in 1905 because that was the development of the first Black theater, which was the Picking, which was at 27th and State Street. And so I never want to ignore that because there was the development of vaudeville, but also was the first entertainment house that afforded African Americans the opportunity to work. Then in 1910, William Foster formed his Foster Photoplay Company, which was the first African American film company in the country as well. But we're talking about 1933. The 1933 Theodore Ward, who was one of the founders of the Negro Federal Theater with licensed user Richard Wright, developed a program at the Abraham Lincoln Center. And it was the beginning of the Negro unit of the Federal Theater Project. So that was as early as 1933. And so in 1940, the Southtown Community Arts Center opened, which is now celebrating its 80th year as a continuous company that was developed as a result of the WPA program. And it's the only art center that still exists out of the 110 that was developed in that period of time. 1941, Langston Hughes founded the Skyloft Theater at the Parkway Community House. Theodore Ward founded the Federal Theater along with Richard Wright. The Chicago Negro Theater was founded by Dr. Margaret Burroughs, who also founded the DuSable Museum. The Center Owl Players was developed by Mickey Grant. The Du Bois Theater Guild was developed by Oscar Brown Jr. and Richard Durham and Vernon Jarrett, who wrote for the Sun-Times. And the Tempo Players was developed by Walter Lott, and the New Steel Players by John Huston, all in the 1940s. But I also want to talk about rental spaces. I'm going to do this really quickly and move on. So if you were doing performances during that period of time, there were not that many places where you could go. So the Hull House was available, the Chicago Park District, the YMCA, which was located at 8th and Wabash, the Abraham Lincoln Center, which was on Oakenwall, McCormick Place was some place that Jerry Jones used to do his productions. The Southtown Community Arts Center, as I mentioned before. Specific to Hyde Park, the St. James Church at 46th and Ellis is where Oscar Brown Jr. did a lot of his work, along with the Harper Theater, which I think at one point was called the Hyde Park Theater as well, which is still at 53rd, between 53rd and 52nd and Harper. And the Cultural Messengers, Mark Williams, he had a facility at 51st and Harper. There's a little brown building that he had his theater company there. So they were operating during that period of time. So as I mentioned, the Southside Community Arts Center was developed in the 40s, and the Southside Center for the Performing Arts opened by Theodore Ward in 1967. And I became his assistant director there at the theater during that period of time. 1967, the Afro Arts Theater. I don't want to go to the 70s because I know, Mark, that you're going to work on that a little later in the presentation. But Hyde Park was always seen as an area in which it was opened enough for people to be able to congregate, and its level of integration in terms of the arts was not only expressed but appreciated in terms of people's ability to be able to function around the Hyde Park area. And so Harper Square was the place to be, and was for a long period of time. Sorry that I can't go out there now and see the people playing chess. And whenever I would come back to Chicago, because I lived in California for 25 years, whenever I came to Chicago, I knew that if I went to Harper Square, I would see everybody that I needed to see. So I'm going to stop there, Mark, and unless you have another question specific to that.
Well, I wondered if you could say something briefly about its influence on you, because you were coming up then in the 60s, I would think.
We went through a period during that period of time where the majority of the performances that were done was in a way white theater that was done by Black people. So Okoro Harold Johnson, who was the founder of ETA, worked for the Park District. I met him in 1957. I was 7 years old, and he was teaching theater there and took me under his wing and let me start directing my plays when I was, I think, 12 or 13, 14, something like that. During the 60s, the art began to shift to work that was written and constructed by Black writers. And that had a major influence on me because I began to have the opportunity to work with Oscar Brown Jr. and Ted Ward and Leandra Jones and Abinah Joan Brown and Val Gray Ward and a number of these people that became giants. And one of the things that I say a lot is that greatness shouldn't be determined by name recognition, but by contributions made and lives touched. And a lot of these people touched the lives of a number of folks that are now very successful in the business, but would not have had that opportunity had it not been for the development of those theaters during that period of time. It also impacted young people in the community. It gave them a voice. It gave them an opportunity to look at themselves in a more positive fashion, because that's what theater does. When you reconstruct the history and the knowledge of its people, it can't do anything but raise them up. And so to be able to walk into, I saw a play in high school called Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadows, which was around the work of Paul Laurence Dunbar. And it changed my life. I saw that show and I said, well, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I'm going to do that. I'm going to create those kind of shows. It was the first play to tour CPS. And it was by Oscar Brown Jr. and Okoro Harold Johnson and Keelan Field Coran. And they did the show, and it just turned me on in a different way, because though I had seen theater, I had never seen anything that represented us until that period of time.
That's so important.
Hmm.
Thank you. You touched on something that's really interesting and really important. That's part of this, is that the separation of of races at that time too. And over the course of the talk, by the end of this talk, actually, you're going to start to see some tentative coming together. But there was a distinct separation.
And there still is, because you know when you process the development of art, there's one thing to select a play and then to hire some Black people to do it if you are any other race, and to allow or to participate in the construction of art by opening the door for people to tell the stories that they want to tell. If you have to sit on top of any ethnic group's ability to be able to construct a story that will help them to improve the quality of their lives, then you have done a disservice. An example that I use is that if I was told that if somebody brought me a play or a movie and they said, we want to do the Shirley Temple story. And I said, okay, great. Shirley Temple was a wonderful person. She was a dancer. She went on to do all the things she did. But I want to tell it through the eyes of Bojangles, the dancer, the Black dancer that worked with us. So let's see it through his eyes. Because that is what had happened in the past regarding Black theater being done inside institutions that we didn't control. It was always a selection of materials that was done by somebody else that they favored and had very little to do with us. Another example, Porky and Bess. Porky and Bess has been done any number of times. However, it wasn't even the best play that was constructed during that period. The work, the Ted Ward's On Land, or the piece that was done by William Grant Steele, in terms of it was written at the same period of time, but did not get the exposure because of the kind of story that it was telling. And so it's important that all groups not only allow for the perpetuation of art, but also understand the importance of that art being told through the eyes of the people that have lived it and should be perpetuating it.
to make the point, at the same time, around the same time that Pemon's even talking about, there was the university, and we're talking about the same area of the city. Robert Maynard Hutchins was the president of the University of Chicago, and he had developed what a lot of you, I'm sure, know this, what he called the New Plan at the University of Chicago, which in its simplest form, it eliminated grades, it eliminated required courses and had more general courses. He put an emphasis on the great books. He also did an interesting thing. When students were ready, at the end of the year, they didn't take tests all along. They took like this big comprehensive test at the end. But the most interesting thing, at least to my subject here, is the fact that he thought high schools weren't doing a very good job of teaching, and he let anybody of any age, if you could pass the test, into the university. So you started having teenagers, young teenagers, showing up at the university. Joyce Piven had told me about that, and I got very interested in that. So I read this book, which some of you may have read. It's called the University of Chicago History by John Boyer. And I wanted to talk to John himself. So I sat down with John, and he explained it this way.
Now, what Hutchins did, over the course of the 1930s, he had the idea that this was such a great program that we ought to recenter it and have younger students come. He was convinced that the high schools were doing a very poor job, in most cases, of educating young people. And so that why not start the core curriculum? In fact, why not start college 2 years early, have kids come here after the second year of high school? Did other radical things like eliminating course grading and so forth, so that you would read all of these books, and then at the end of every year, you would take a 6-hour exam. If you passed the exam, you get credit for the whole year. So this program, 1942, extended really well into the 1950s, and the people you're in correspondence with or talking with were part of that second iteration. And that was quite a remarkable time. The story I tell in my book is having talked to people who graduated back then, the kind of passion and the fervor that they have embedded in their memories about what their experiences was just extraordinary. This was like the high point of their lives in some ways.
So I went there at 17, but there were kids there who were 12 and 13. They were prodigies of sorts, brilliant. And we all found each other there. And these were major theater talents as teenagers. Mike Nichols, Ed Astor, Barbara Harris, Gene Trubnick, and Severin Darden. Great theater talents. They all came there. If you could pass the test, you could be there. Paul got there. He was a soldier in the war and came back on the GI Bill, University of Chicago. Another person who would never have gotten there. And so that's part of the culture.
Culture.
All this energy.
You just read the original works. If you were studying optics, you read Huygens. If you studied Kant, you didn't have a textbook with Kant in it. You studied Kant. You read the text. I was 17. I was in heaven. Everybody was nuts. I was nuts. Everybody weird went to the University of Chicago.
People tend to forget that U of C was a mecca for a certain kind of bohemian or quasi-bohemian outsider intellectual. Witness Elaine May. They didn't even take classes there, but they were there. They were on the scene. They were part of that culture. Mike Nichols, Susan Sontag. This was a milieu that you're not to see repeated until maybe Berkeley in the 60s, and then in a much attenuated form. And so you had this freak show in terms of what the larger populace would look at and see. But it was a remarkable time. There was a remarkable bunch of people that created those companies that then later turned in 59 into Second City.
And there you go. There was no theater department at the University of Chicago, famously. And so Paul Sills, who you see there on your right, started his own theater company, and they called it the Playwrights Theater Club. And there'll be more on that in a second. But I want to show you something. Do you remember Avery Schreiber? That's Avery Schreiber there. And this is Viola Spolin, who is Paul's mother. And she had a powerful influence on all of this. It's a subject for another talk, but she had a great influence on all of this. Another person that came into this, though, at a very young age, was somebody that I just loved when I was in high school. Oh, there's Paul at the Playwrights Theater Club. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of order. That's the group there, the Playwrights Theater Club. Up at the top is David Shepard, who came to Chicago, met Paul, and he had a little bit of money in his pocket because he had an aunt or somebody who had died, so he had a little bit of inheritance. There's Ed Asner as a very young man. And this is Joyce Piven down here, who you'd heard speak earlier. I spoke to all of them, including, if you look all the way over here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the woman in the front row on the far left in the stripes is named Joy Carlin. I spoke to her, and she's very proud of the fact that she made that dress herself. Here's some of the people who were part of it. Barbara Harris, who I just adored. This is her in Nashville. She was in Thousand Clowns with Jason Robards. It's Mike Nichols and Elaine May. I mentioned that Ed Asner was a part of that before. But here's Barbara Harris at a very young age. And I asked her how she ended up as part of the Playwrights Theater Club. And she told me that she had gotten out of high school, and she was studying at a community college in the area, and she was interested in theater. And I said, why? And she said, I have no idea why, I just was interested. And this tells you something about the time too. She was trying to figure out, where do I get involved in theater? And the only thing she could think of is to go to one of the big houses downtown that had traveling shows and to volunteer. But then she heard about this little company that was starting. And at that time they were on North Avenue, but they had actually begun at Mandel Hall, up on the 3rd floor of Mandel Hall. And then they moved to a little place on North Avenue. And she tells very briefly here the story of how she ended up there. And it's so fickle.
And my brother-in-law was an instructor at the UC. They were living in a little basement apartment there. And up above them was a man named Herman Piven, who was a sociologist, and my brother-in-law was a sociologist, and I guess they talk now and again. Herman says his brother had just started, was in a theater on North Avenue, and whatever was said, they called me up and said, well, there's going to be this place, there's this place that just started down the street. And I got on a bus and I walked in.
I just love that sentence. That's why I pulled it out. I got on a bus and I walked in, and it absolutely changed her life. She became part of the very first Second City cast. She went to New York with them, and then she got cast in Apple Tree, and things just kind of really took off for her. But I got on a bus and I walked in. There's Viola Spolin, and that's her book. I'm sorry I had gotten out of order. So here's David Shepard. And I mentioned that he had a few bucks in his pocket, and he donated that to the Playwrights Theater Club. But the other thing is, he had always had this idea, and it's what brought him to Chicago, to have like a people's theater, a theater that would address the needs and the interests and the concerns of people in the area. And what he started was, it was something he called the Compass Players. And he said he called it Compass Players because a compass tells you where you're at. And that's what he meant his theater to do. I've got a friend of mine, Michael Golding, who was very close to David Shepard, has all of his stuff, stuff like this. But look at this. I thought you'd be interested to see. This is a drawing of David drew of the Compass Theater before it was even built up. It was over at, what's the name of the bar? Jimmy's Bar. And if you probably can't see, I don't know what size device you're looking at, but here's the space on the left is the seats, or cabaret seats, the stage up at the top. And the director was Sills and Shepard and Elaine May. The acting coach was Elaine May. And what I thought was so interesting was bought a block of seats, Bernie Solins, who ended up helping finance the start of Second City and running Second City for a long time. But I love looking at things like that. There are some of them. They're sitting in the cabaret, perhaps. That's Barbara Harris on the right, looking a little moody. Mike Nichols and Shelley Berman, who joined them a little later. Eugene Shrubnik, Elaine May. So I introduced you earlier to Bill Matthew, who was accompanist at Compass Players. And he was 18 years old when he started doing that. He just kind of wandered into it like Barbara did. And he went from there to becoming the first musical director at Second City. And he tells me a really cool story about, here's improvisation, just getting started. People trying to figure out what is improvisation? How do you do it? What are some of the rules to it? And Bill was hired at 17 to be the intermission accompanist, and that was his sole job, was to play the intermission. He tells me this story about how he discovered how do you support an improvisational scene with the piano. And if you've ever been to Second City, you probably know Fred Kaz's work and how he did that. Fred Kaz followed Bill Matthew and took it to a whole nother level. But this is the story of the beginning of this, and I just love it.
I'd go to some of the rehearsals because I got to be really fascinated, and David wanted me to come. He said, you're part of this company, even though you're the intermission pianist. But I only was there part-time, and then gradually I did sort of work my way into the theater. Here's my first, and maybe any pianist's first accompanying an improvised scene. Okay, you ready for this?
I am.
Mike Nichols came to me when they were planning the set after the show in the intermission and in the break between the show and the set, and said, we're gonna do a scene in a Paris cafe. Will you play background music like La Vie en Rose, right? A song which I scarcely knew, but maybe that was Rites of Spring.
One of those.
Wait. I didn't know it then, and I don't know it now.
That's pretty good, though.
And so, anyway, so he asked me to play that. So I didn't know it, so it came time to play. The lights went up, and I was playing, right? And I was sort of picking the tune out, and I had no idea what was going on stage. I didn't look up. And I was playing loud, and I was trying to figure out the fucking song, which he wanted. And so they were having a conversation at a table. It was Mike and Elaine, and they were, it was a make scene, as usual, one of the many. And obviously they were having to speak louder and louder, and Mike would say things on stage that I could hear. He says, isn't it interesting how loudly we have to speak in this cafe? And I was kind of oblivious. And finally he said, Garçon, piano player, you there, could you play softer? And I turned around like, oh, what the fuck? There's a scene going on in back of me.
Was that incredible?
Oh my God, the most embarrassing moment and the beginning of the history.
I was going to say embarrassing and seminal.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, that was my lesson. I only had to be told once. I mean, it was an education. I had to learn to play in the service of, not of the actors, in the service of the scene. And that was an education for an 18-year-old striver like I was.
One of the things I like about that, it plays right into some of the themes of the book. And really, because I couldn't tell the entire history of some of the theaters that I was dealing with, it really deals with the genesis of a lot of these companies, or in this case, is the genesis of how that scene came about. And one of the things I loved about talking to some of these people is you learn about when they were learning about things. They were trying to figure out things that hadn't happened before. And I just find that incredibly exciting. Maybe you could hear it in my tone of voice when I was talking to him. All right, this is Bruce Sagan, who some of you probably know. Bruce Sagan owned the Hyde Park Herald. Whoops, the Hyde Park Herald. And one of the things that's interesting about what he did was he bought the Harper Theater not because he wanted to start a theater, but because he wanted office space for the newspaper. And the theater was there. And so he started, thinking, well, maybe we could make something of this. Along the way, he ends up developing the first equity contract for small theaters in Chicago, which opened the doors for a lot of storefront theaters. But this was a much larger theater that he made smaller by putting a curtain down at the point where the balcony ended, and made it a 300-seat theater, like what was going on in New York. And Bruce tells the story.
And into this mix, strangely enough, comes the need of the Hyde Park Herald, a newspaper I published, for an office. And the Harper Theater building was built in the traditional Chicago 1900s style. There's along the main street is the offices upstairs and the stores downstairs, and behind it is the theater. The theater family, the Schoenstatt family, had closed the Harper. And so you had sitting there the closed theater, and in the front building, there was a big office suite upstairs. There was still one doctor left who was a dentist. We needed an office, and the building was for sale. And it was for sale at a very reasonable sum.
And it was a theater and all that.
And it was a theater. Meanwhile, the idea of the small theater was burgeoning in New York. This was a real theater. And the idea was to build a 300-seat house. And what we did was we walled off the back. We dropped the wall at the balcony down below. So we created on the main floor, under the balcony, a coffee shop. And at 55th and Woodlawn Avenue, there used to be a drugstore built in 1911, an independent, locally owned store, which got torn down in the urban renewal plan. And they were leaving behind all of the fixtures of this drugstore. And we took all those fixtures out of 55th and Woodlawn, and we put them into the coffee shop that we were creating in the Harper Theater. And if you want to see what it looked like, you go see the ice cream parlor in the Museum of Science and Industry, because that's where we gave the fixtures. Meanwhile, Sickinger was working, and we thought, okay, Sickinger is doing essentially non-equity theater. And if this is to grow, we're going to do equity theater. And we're going to bring some of that theater here. There was, after all, no big actors pool. There was there were no off-loop theaters. They didn't exist. There was simply this, quote, amateur, but I mean, Sickinger stuff was very professional. I want to make that clear.
Technically, they were amateur.
Technically, right, they had no equity contract. We wrote the off-loop equity union contract for union actors. We had the first 300-seat off-loop contract. We actually created it. They had a contract for nightclubs. And we took the cabaret contract and scratched it up and made a 300-seat equity contract.
Doesn't he even sound amazed by that himself? I mean, but it became that too became a very seminal moment. Now this is the 70s when Pemon and I were both kids. And this is a very influential time too. One of the great pleasures is the people I get to meet along the way as I was working on this book. And one of the greatest afternoons I had was sitting down with Val Gray Ward, who was founded the Kumba Theater Workshop. And Pemon, could you give me, you worked with her and you worked for her and you've known her a long time. Could you give us a sense of who she is and what her significance to the history of Chicago theater is?
Val, in many ways, should be considered the godmother of Black theater. In many ways, she was responsible for the ideology moving forward of what Black theater became. Prior to the 1960s period, as I mentioned, the majority of the work that people were doing was the replication of work that was being done by other theaters. So you had Harold Johnson, Okoro Harold Johnson doing, gosh, what was the name of the play? With Randall, with Randall and the Cape. Anyway, can't remember the name of the play. Anyway, so they were basically doing a number of the white performances of white plays, but with Black actors. And when Val came in, she began to change that. She was an actress first, and my first exposure to her was in a bookstore. Because you have to keep in mind there weren't that many theaters. So A.J. Williams had a bookstore on 79th Street with a room in the back where performances would go on. And we were invited there one night and we saw this woman perform, and she just was absolutely incredible. And then she founded the Kumba Workshop, which was a training and performance module that allowed for the participation of not only actors, but most of the members of AACM worked there with her in terms of music. A lot of the members of Obasi, that was formed there. And then she wrote a lot of philosophical material about what Black theater meant and what it represented, what was the philosophy, what was the mission. And she was very good at that. I just want to go back for 1 second to Viola Spolin, because she had a major impact on me as well. You know, when you are developing in theater, you have to look for opportunities, right? So there weren't a lot of facilities. And so in us going to begin to develop, we had to go to places that already existed. So Viola Spolin and her improvisation work in her book was what I basically used to teach theater very, very early. And then we went to her workshops. You know, they used to have these workshops up at one of the abbeys in one of the suburbs. And we would go up to the Abbey and we would participate in the workshops. And then we would come back and we would then train people based on what we would be learning. And that was the same thing with Val. She might not be known as well in Chicago, but internationally she is highly respected, and also gave voice to poets. A lot of the poets that are now famous are famous because Val was articulating their work. She was interpreting it. She was bringing the fire to the crowds. And as a result, a lot of other people became noticed.
She was very close to Gwendolyn Brooks too, wasn't she?
She was extremely close to Gwendolyn Brooks and to Dr. Margaret Burroughs. As a matter of fact, there's a picture of her standing at the DuSable Museum, their chains on the door when they unlocked it the first time, when they got the new property in Washington Park. Yeah. And Val and Margaret Burroughs and Gwendolyn Brooks are all in that photograph as they were opening. She was incredible. And as a result of, I mean, I love her dearly and have worked with her over many, many years.
Oh, that's wonderful. I was so pleased to get to meet her. And while I was sitting there, obviously we're not social distance because it's a long time before all this happened, but I'm just 3 feet away from her, and she suddenly launched into one of these characters. She did several of them, and Pemon just said it was he saw her perform and it was just amazing. And here I am just 2 feet away, and I want you to hear this because I think it's pretty wonderful.
Harriet Tubman. I walked up the hill and down the hill and through the woods and over streams and roads, but I ain't never looked back. My body got tired. And then my legs got stiff. My mouth got dry. And my eyes shed tears. But I ain't never looked back. Cause I wanted to go on to freedom. I got weary. And I got slow. Oh, my body was so tired. But I asked him to just keep pushing me. Keep making me tread till I want you, Lord, to walk with me. Walk with me, Lord. So, but that's what I do, and that's what I've always done.
That's pretty wonderful.
My first exposure to Val, she was doing a performance that was written by Richard Wright. It's called Between the World and Me. And it's about a woman that's walking through the woods and stumbles upon a lynching. And to this day, I can still feel her eyes in her performance that she gave. You know, when you go through the pictures, Mark, and you point out all of the people that became famous, that were part of these early companies. Here in Chicago, especially on the South Side, we were blessed with the same level of talent. Not as much exposure as some of those other folks ended up getting, but the people that we were working with were magnificent. They were absolutely incredible, and some went on to successful careers, and others went on to teach people that became successful. But to work with Val Gray Ward and Oscar Brown Jr., those two people in particular, Val developed what was called ritual theater, and it was the construction of something that would be as visceral as it was performance. And so she would take theater, and she would take poetry, and she would take music, and she would create these rituals, and that became her performance pieces. Oscar Brown Jr. developed what was called a dome, a dramatic organization of musical expression, which is how he defined it. And it was taking his music and characters and creating a play without a book, because you didn't have a script, but you had a story that was based on the interconnectedness of these songs and these characters that he was creating. And it opened up a whole new world. Wow. Because we had to, at some point, wait for the development of writers to excel or to learn the process. And within that, they did some remarkable work. And it was just great to be a part of that period.
I love hearing Pemon talk about, you know, the generation ahead of him, like Oscar Brown and Val Gray Ward, and the influence on him. Pardon me. One of the things I found so interesting in this whole investigation I did is the interplay between generations, and you just heard it in Pemon's voice there. Pemon, I want to play this for you. This is Aaron Todd Douglas, a young actor and a director and a teacher, and he talks about ETA Creative Arts in very much the same way. Listen to this.
And I've always encouraged every African-American actor to, you know, you got to go through ETA at some point. I just think it's a valuable experience.
Why?
I think the theater that they create is immediate. I think the audience interaction is so incredibly valuable to deal with that type of audience, that type of smart yet blue collar audience who is readily available to interact with you. You can't fool them, you can't trick them, you can't condescend to them. You really have to bring the goods, and they'll let you know about it if you don't.
You said it's essential as an African American Actor. What do you mean?
It's an African American theater company, African American arts organization. It is with roots miles deep here in Chicago. Abena has gone on to be with the ancestors, but I consider her, you know, one of those elders I mentioned. Abena Joan Brown is just, she and her peers, they laid an incredible foundation for the African American art community, and I wanted to be in touch with that tradition.
You hear that phrase? I wanted to be in touch with that tradition.
You know, every group needs something that is a reflection of who and what they are. And the Black theater companies had two objectives originally when they were formed. One was to reconstruct history and to tell it in a way that would be beneficial to the upliftment of people. The second was to provide opportunity for actors that they couldn't get anyplace else. And the third was to construct a future that was beneficial to where we saw ourselves in the long run. So ETA's objective was to, number one, teach people what theater meant. When we first started forming theater and doing performances, you would have people in the audience talking as much to the actors as the actors themselves. And, you know, the interplay between the audience, you know, if you've never been to a play, do you know that you are not supposed to do that, or that you're not supposed to sing along with the songs, or that you're supposed to be on time, or something as simple as that? They created not only an audience, but how you perceive theater, what it should be about, what the writers should be. And every one of these theaters had a writer's workshop because they wanted to develop plays as well. But I also wanted to mention some other people, because I don't want to get out of here without having the opportunity to recall how vibrant the South Side was. Excuse me. So from 1960 to 1980, I'm just going to cover that period because some of the other existing companies, you know, we can cover that later time. But there was the New Concept Theater founded by Marcus Nelson. Of course, ETA that we talked about. The Experimental Black Actors Guild, which is called X-Bag, was at the Hull House. The Chicago Theater Company ultimately came into the Hull House after X-Bag. You had the Kumba Workshop with Val Kusima. The Kusima players were at Washington Park. I mentioned H. Mark Williams that was on Harper. The Black Heritage Theatrical Players, that was the Reverend Spencer Jackson and his family, the original Jackson family. And they were singers, and he was a minister, and he did a number of performances. The Chicago Black Ensemble, well, of course, with Jackie Taylor, which she started, I think, in 1976. The Lamazzino Theater, which was on the west side, that I founded along with Usini Perkins. The Jabu Children's Theater Company that Masekwa Myers formed. Ira Rogers was producing things in Hyde Park. Jerry Jones was at the, as I mentioned, at McCormick Place. And the New Era Theater was in a basement on 81st Street. All of those were active during that period of time.
There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. And you look at something like ETA, 50 years. And they just changed, they just got a new artistic director before all this happened, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And it has been 50 years. And you have to keep in mind that this was new to people, to be able to commit to anything artistic. And you know, I think we're going to talk about this later. But, you know, a lot of theaters always talk about what is our competition. And so when we, a lot of times when people are framing competition, they'll say, well, my competition is the Court Theater, or my competition is the Goodman Theater or Victory Gardens. And that's really not reality. The competition is sports. The competition is going out to dinner. There are all kinds of things that you have to look at when you're looking at your wallet, and you have to decide, do I go see a play, or do I go to watch the Chicago Bulls play? So competition is really quite big. So that means that as an artistic entity, you have to really decide who is my audience, why are they there, and why should they come and support what I do?
Yeah. You mentioned the court. I wanted to play a little bit about how that even came about, and then we'll take some questions.
Okay.
This is the great Nick Ruddle, by the way, the founding director of the Court Theater, and he told me this wonderful story. In Chicago, you know, Pemon just went through this fabulous list of all this vibrant work that was going on here, and there was other stuff going on the north side, and the rest of the country really didn't know about this at all. And to a certain degree, they still don't, but they didn't know about it then. And Nick tells this great story, and he tells it so well.
Of Philip Roth managed to get Claire Bloom to come here to perform scenes of women in Shakespeare in Mandel Hall, and the place was packed. The number of seats was notorious. It was 1066, and there were 1066 people in there. And I won't say his name because he's dead now and he was a friend of mine, but he introduced Claire Bloom as coming into this desert of theater. The place fucking exploded in booze because it was, and she was devastated, but he was a writer. But he was already there, in other words.
Yeah.
That was...
but only Chicago knew it at that point.
That's right. Because it was something like, this is it's before 1980. So it's in the mid to late 70s that this happened. So I've always remembered that the people in the theater booed when the introducer of Claire Bloom was gracefully greeting her into this desert of theater. And everyone knew it's not that. It's different.
That really marks it in time, too, in our history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That we knew it, the world didn't know it yet. It was that moment.
Yeah.
And that's why we're trying to get this story out there. So Nick came to Chicago in 1966 to work at the University of Chicago. He came from Cambridge, and he was hired as a classics professor, but he saw that there was in this courtyard, outdoors in the summer, there was a community theater kind of production going on in the courtyard every summer. And he was asked if he would turn that into a professional operation. And that ends up, if you fast forward, that ends up giving us the Court Theater. But this is how Nick tells it.
What Levy said to me was, it's important to have the arts here on the South Side in a professional capacity. Because if we have theater, dance, music, and the visual arts, the Smart Gallery is next door. The law professors and the doctors and the hospital will still live in the neighborhood, right? They'll stay. And it worked out. And so in 1971, he asked me if I thought it was possible to create a professional theater. He loved professional theater. So I said, well, let's try it in the summer. And so I turned the summer court, which was a community theater, into an equity theater, doing plays in repertory. So in my first year doing this, I said, the first thing I have to do is find some directors who want to do this. And in my first year doing this, I hired Bob Falls for his first job. Bob did The Tempest. Oh, Bob laughs at it all the time because I held auditions. I didn't know what I was doing in some sense, and neither did Bob. Bob came to audition, and he wasn't very good in the audition. And so I said, would you like to direct? And he still laughs at it because we were all so young. And he was fantastic. And then the theater explosion started to happen with Steppenwolf and the organic theater. So the next year I hired Stuart Gordon to do Rashomon, which is a play of the Japanese movie. And there's a famous scene in the movie where there's a huge downpour on an old man who sees the scene of the murder. And of course it was Stewart, so with Jack Wallace.
Oh, yeah.
Jack Wallace played the, he had just been released from prison. It was a hell of a time. Stewart put hoses up into the elms. And very suddenly in the middle, it poured like it did in the movie, and the audience just went crazy because it was insane, but it was great. What happened was that even after about 4 or 5 years of my doing this outdoors over the summer, 3 plays a summer, Dutch elm disease came.
Oh my God.
And these enormous trees, which created a sound barrier, were gone.
Changes everything.
Changed everything.
And so what he ended up doing was moving the theater company indoors into a space that he fashioned. I think he said he bought chairs for about 75 cents a piece from someplace and created this theater, and then in time raised money. And there he is. Whoop, he went by too fast. But that's him pointing to the model of the theater that we know now. Sorry about that. I want you to see it. There he is. That's Nick, second from the left, pointing to the theater that we know now. But what you heard in that, just in that nutshell, was the genesis of the court theater that we know today. And then Nick,
My understanding
Charlie
is
Newell,
that
Charlie Newell took over, and he talks very briefly here about what he saw when he looked at the theater and why it amazed him so much.
From 78 to 81, when the monies were being raised and the design was being finalized, there was an original plan for, in addition to a fly house and a trap room, another thing, a larger scene shop, there was going to be a balcony so that the theater would hold 400 people. For a variety of reasons, depending on who you talk to, that the building had to be reduced. So what they did is they took the balcony away, but they did not shrink the performance, the house, the performance, the stage house, the performance area. So I've been looking in the country, where else do you have such a large footprint for performance of the stage with relatively so few seats? So that proportion to, it's an intimate house of 250 seats, and yet can have a scale in the design and the use of scenic elements that's much larger than any other 250 seat house. So it has a unique combination of intimacy and scale.
And then I'll close with this, and then we can carry on the conversation after it. But Charlie, looked. We were talking earlier about this separation of peoples, and Charlie started wondering, how can I do something about that at the court? And this is what he did. And then it's Charlie, and then it goes to Ron O.J. Parson, a director, and then we'll take your questions.
Eight years ago, I looked around and I thought, Charlie, you're not really serving your local community. Despite having cast actors of color as leads in Beckett plays and Barber of Seville and Cyrano de Bergerac and other stuff, we were not, the percentage of our audience of color was like 5 or 7%. So I thought, well, I can keep, as a director, trying to find a way to look at work through an African-American perspective, or I can do something more aggressive. And so I did 2 things. One is I said, we need to expand our definition of classic theater to include the African-American canon. The second thing I did is that I hired Ron O.J. Parson as our resident artist. Well, did the court thing give you kind of a foundation?
Yeah, it's a home base.
That's your home base.
Right.
You have a formal title there, and I don't remember what it is.
I'm a resident artist.
Resident artist?
Mm-hmm.
How did Charlie present that to you? How did that come?
Well, after after the success of Fences, he realized we need to do more of this. We're in a community that's very diverse, so we need to be diverse.
Prior to that, there's a lot of classics.
Prior to that, they hadn't done much of anything with people of color, and even being right in Hyde Park.
Was it on Charlie's mind to do that?
I think that's why I wanted to do Fences, because, you know, August Wilson was very popular, and so he wanted to, you know, get in on, take advantage of that. And then we had such a our audience, the audience changed when we did Fences. More people came in there, more black people came in there. So he approached me with doing different things. So we did Wait Until Dark with a whole diverse cast. Just began to look at things different. And I think he appreciated that.
Charlie, I talked to Charlie about that. This really coincides with what Charlie told me, which was he really wanted to be much more a part of the community than it had been.
Right.
And that it changed very quickly.
Exactly.
In terms of the audience composition and the interest.
Well, it changed when that Fences production really changed things. And then the shows that I've done there, it just brought a whole new outlook to the theater and the community. I knew people there in Hyde Park that didn't even know the theater existed. Black people didn't even know it was there. And a lot of them, even to this day, it's their first time when they get there. Because now they've heard. But a few years ago, they told me the audience went from 5% to 30% people of color, which is a lot.
Yeah.
And so it allowed us to look at outside the box for a lot of plays, you know?
King Headley is the last show we were able to see at the Court Theater
Outside the box
live.
For a lot of plays, you know?
Sorry about that. Pemon, do you want to respond to this? Actually, that's Pemon and I at the Green Line Center for Performing Arts. It was an event hosted by Maseko Meyer, and that was us having a conversation. So I thought it'd make it look like we're in a room together. Have this conversation. Do you want to respond? You did a spotlight for Ron, right? Can you say?
Yes, I think I've done 3 of them. But let me just go back a minute to the court, because I'm a Chicago theater person, and that being the case, I never felt that we were welcomed at the court. None of us did. You know, we bypassed the court like we bypassed a number of theaters during that period of time. And it wasn't until Charlie arrived and Ron that people began to look at it differently. Because at some point you do really have to or need to address what is your community. And that community really should be your circumference, but also the people that are interested in what you do. And so they opened it up with a different eye. They started partnering with other institutions in the community. They started doing productions that would draw additional people in. And I think that was great for them to be able to do it. And I know that Charlie has an interest in broadening the perspective of people that come in there and broadening the audience. And that's how we're going to ultimately have to look at everything, because it should really be about inclusion rather than exclusion. And too many times it's the opposite. So the Spotlight program is the opportunity for the presentation of historic, what should be considered classic African-American work in a variety of different communities so that they could be exposed to some of the productions that were done during the 60s and 70s. And the court started that a few years ago. I've directed, I think, 3 productions for them. And until the COVID situation, they had, I think, another 5 or 6 lined up to do again this year. But it's a great program. And one of the productions that I directed for them was called The Mighty Gents, which is a piece about a street gang that's gotten old and they're still looking back on their lives as to, what they've done or not done with their lives. And when we did the reading, one of the people in the audience said that she felt more related to that production than anything else that she had seen. And my response to her was that it's because it was written for you. It was specifically written for a community, and it told their story. And whenever that happens, you respond in a different way. And so I commend the court on what they have done in terms of outreach. And hopefully after this nonsense is over, they will be able to continue on that track.
Great. Michael, could you take us off of Spotlight so that we could see? And I'd love to hear some of the questions, Dottie, if there are questions there.
Here's a question that both of you, it would be great if you answers. What happened to the theaters on the South Side? How did it go from so many to so few today?
My initial response would be diversity. When the Goodman and Victory Gardens and Steppenwolf and the court started doing or expanding under the guise of audience expansion and development, they received the funding that the original African-American companies were receiving. So the support for the Black theater stopped, and that support went to white theaters that were doing one production or maybe two per year. That's what happened to them.
Mark, could you stop sharing your screen? That way we can, because I've canceled.
Oh, that's in my
Spotlight.
hand. Yeah.
There we go.
Is that good?
Yes.
I think now we can see everybody. And anybody of you who have got your video turned off who want to join the conversation and turn your video on, you're welcome to do that. And it's good to see you all. Rosellen Brown, I haven't seen you in a while. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Rosellen. I didn't know you were there. One of the questions I heard earlier that Michael sent me was, is Chicago theater going to survive all of this? And if so, how? And that's a question that Sekwa and Pemon and I have had before, and I've had with other people. And Pemon, I think you have an interesting take on that. Do you want to share it? Because first, I'll start with this, though. Mm-hmm. None of us has a crystal ball. I mean, we're speculating about what's going to happen. But what are your thoughts on that, Pemon?
Mark, as you know, I spent about 1.5 years as a judge for the Jeff Committee. And within that process, those 250 theaters that you mentioned, I probably visited close to 200 of them and saw 170 plays within the course of 1.5 years. And within that process, realized the quality of some of the theaters versus some of the others that were just sort of getting by. So there are two things that I think will happen. One, I think that a number of the companies will dissolve, and maybe rightfully so, and some of them will combine to become stronger. Secondly, I think that because we are artists, we have always created something new. You know, it's, you know, to use rap music as an example, you know, if music had not been taken out of the schools, there would probably have never been rap music. Because people weren't learning instruments, they started using records to scratch and making their own music.
Great.
And so I think that in this process, it will require creative minds to come together and say, so how do we do this differently? Those institutions that have the money and the resources, you know, they'll build plexiglass pieces, they'll move their seats out of the way, they'll make all the necessary provisions to survive, and some of them will. The smaller theater companies, in my estimation, will not, because if you got a 60-seat theater, you can only operate on, you know, half of that. I don't think that you're going to be able to survive in the same way. But it's also an opportunity for people to begin to look at how do we do all of this differently? How do we really live up to what diversity should mean? Because diversity, in my estimation, shouldn't just be your allowing one Black play in your institution per year.
Right.
There should be a consortium of people that sit down and say, what is within the best interest of all of these communities, and how do we construct productions that will speak to that? If you are not going to allow people to tell their own stories, there's a disservice in the first place. Finally, my final comment. There are so many incredibly talented young artists that are coming up that only need the opportunity to reach their creative objectives by being provided resources, by being provided institutions in which they can thrive, and by being able to collectively market what we do, which is something that we were able to do during the 60s. You know, when we had the Black Theater Alliance, we collectively bought an ad in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, because we knew that if we combined our money, we could utilize it more collectively to market. You know, so some of those things I think will take place. And then finally, I think we'll be forced to tell different types of stories.
What do you mean by that? Pemon?
The term classic is defined by who and under what circumstance. And so who decided that, for example, August Wilson's work were classics, or anybody else? We have to allow people to value their own work, to construct their own stars, to be able to build their communities in a way that you meet the needs of the folks that are there. I had a friend that did a play once that was about, it was a play in a play about this gay couple, and the male actor wasn't gay, and he had to kiss this guy in the play. And he kept putting it off. You know, now it's coming down to opening night. He's trying to, and he still won't do it. Anyway, he quits, and the playwright has to do the play. But nobody came to see the play. So I asked this person who was running the theater, I said, well, what's your audience? He said, women between the ages of 20 and 40. So my question to him was, why did you select that play if that's your audience? And you might very well say to me, because they'll love it. I don't know, but I do know that you have to look at your audience, and you have to look at what is it that's going to make them want to come, that's going to make them want to support your institution. When I used to go to ETA, for example, and this was some years ago, and I don't know if it's still the case because they've got a new leadership there, but everybody in their audience was gray, you know, blue-haired old ladies, because they had been in the business for 50 years, and their audience was getting much, much older, and that's who they were being supported by. But they ultimately have to turn around and find young people that will help to restore an audience that is built of young people. Because if not, the audience is going to die out anyway. Hope that answers the question.
I've been having lots of conversations with people about this, just calling them up and saying, you know, what do you foresee and how are you coping with this? One of the most interesting comments to me was, if we don't come back better, shame on us. Because this person saw this as an opportunity. She called it a reset. I think it was Rashada Dewan. She saw this as a reset. And this is our moment to rethink things and come back better. And that's my hope, is that we can do that. I also hope that we can draw on some of the things that made this community happen. So, you know, it happened over the course of my lifetime from 1952, you know, well, before that, and then into the 50s. It happened relatively rapidly and become very, very intense and powerful. I think part of it was there was a spirit of risk-taking that I think is part of the DNA of this place. I think there's a spirit of cooperation. And one of the things I remember Rashada talking about is, and you were touching on this too, Pemon, is we're going to have to find new ways of partnering. And that has all sorts of creative possibilities that could come of it too. So,
you know, Mark, the only thing that I want to add is at some point people have to go back and really look at purpose. Like, what is the purpose of theater, and why does your institution exist? And does it still exist for the reasons that you started it in the first place? And based on that assumption, what does your audience really need? Like, in terms of stories, you can say that during this period of time, for example, that we need comedies more than we need anything. People need to laugh. They need to get their frustrations out. And so maybe that's the direction in which some people have to go. But at the same time, you have to look at we have to look at audience different. We have to look at the way that we utilize actors different. We have to look at opening up to new voices and new ideas. And we have to invest in young people and their ability to grow, to produce. I had a wonderful experience as a young director. I started directing when I was 14, but I had people that would allow me to work, you know, and to grow. And they would come back and they criticize, you know, but they allowed me the opportunity to walk into their theaters. Val did. Val hired me. I was maybe 17, 18 when I took over her theater, you know. So you have to be able to look at young people, recognize their skill sets, and then provide them with an opportunity as much as humanly possible. And hopefully this will be that opportunity. Those theaters that will survive are going to have to open up to some of the theaters that don't. They're going to have to open up their audiences and their memberships to allow other people to come in. And they're going to have to look at the things that they do in a different way.
Mark, I know this. Can I also just make a comment here?
Please do.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rashada. Thank you so much. Hi, thank you so much for having this. I'm so honored just to even be able to witness and learn all of this information. I just want to say that also, I feel like with exposure, we have to be in the schools more. I don't know how we can press that, but how we get those young audiences, they need exposure to theater. Theater for too long has been seen as this like elitist sort of art form that, you know, young people can't get in or something. I mean, for instance, you know, Holla If You Hear Me on Broadway, that didn't do well, but I mean, maybe in a new world it would, you know, but it's trying to, you know, Hamilton is here, but Holla If You Hear Me was first. So it's sort of like, how do we get more of those opportunities to include these young people, because this is where we're going.
You know, I mentioned earlier that when I was in high school, I had an opportunity to see a production by Oscar Brown Jr. and Okoro and Keelan Phil Karan. And for those of you that don't know, Keelan was the musical impetus for Earth, Wind, and Fire. So it was a really, really talented group of people. But had I seen a bad play that day, I would have been a furniture refinisher. And it's a true story, because that's what my father did. And that's what I really wanted to do. But I was fortunate to see an excellent production, and it drove me in a different direction. So yeah, we need to be in the schools. Young people need to be exposed to a number of things that will allow them the opportunity to decide whether they even have any interest. But first you have to see it to be it. You have to be exposed to it first. And so to have theater go back into the schools so that you're building talent, to go into the community so that you're rebuilding audiences, funding is going to be an issue, but it's an important part, you know, and more things are going to have to be outside. Well, this is Chicago. That's a whole nother concern, but there's going to have to be some things outside eventually. There's no telling what's going to happen with the winter here.
Rashada, what was your earliest exposure?
My father took me to see Stump. I remember, and I used to see shows at the Regal. I remember that the Regal got together with the radio station or something to put on this big talent show, and all the kids had to come down and audition, and it was that. But I remember sitting in a balcony looking and watching Savion Glover, No, but it was Stomp. But it was also, it was another earlier piece that Savion Glover was in, because that was my first exposure. I had never seen anyone on stage perform like that. So I don't know if it was Jelly's Last Jam or something, but I mean, I just know that it was whatever way. I remember being like, whoa, I had never seen anything like that before, and my dad took me. But I will say, even as an adult, I didn't think I would be doing this, but my dad saw the Jackie Wilson Story at Black Ensemble, and I was a young adult, and he drugged me like, you have to come see this show. And I had never seen him be so passionate about a theater production before. And I mean, he wanted to see it over and over and over again. So I mean, it started with my parent actually really loving it and saying he wanted to expose me. So I do want to mention this one other thing too, is theater critics. I wish young people would learn more about how to critique theater as well, because that could also, I don't know of any Black theater critic. Maybe there are some, I don't know. I have not seen any, but I really wish that more young people knew how to critique, because then we know what to look for according to our own opinion and objective.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to get something in?
Yeah, I'd like to point out that up before the COVID virus hit, Court Theater blocked off a number of afternoon performances for high schools and grade school that came in there. I know that to watch various performances.
Excellent.
Mark, we still have a few questions in the chat box.
Let's hear it.
Michael, are we okay on time?
Sure. I mean, as long as everybody wants to hang on, we're here.
So I'm going to start at the top here. Rashida asked, what happened to the building of ETA and that space across the street? Is that ever supposed to start back up? And then she also asked, is the founder of Kumba still active in the arts or involved in some ways? And if so, how can we see and/or support?
The first question, I'm not really sure what is going to happen with ETA. They have a new director, Kai El-Zabar, and it's, you know, she's a very strong and talented person, so hopefully she will be able to lead them to their next frontier. The only thing that I will say about it is, whenever an institution is created, it is, and whether you want to get around it or not, it is created around the personality of its founder. And it's just the reality of it. And so once that person is gone, unless you have a person with the same level of personality that's going to bring other people in, you begin to falter. And so as Abena was getting sick at ETA, and she had raised a considerable amount of money, but they didn't jumpstart it while she was still, before she got ill. Once she became ill, they began to have to sort of modify the direction in which they're going, and they're beginning to do that now. And so hopefully Kai, after all of this is over, will be able to lead it in a different direction. She had planned to have an exceptional opening in theater and season this year, but of course everybody knows what happens. Val Gray Ward is still living. I spoke with her a couple of days ago. She's back in the hospital again. So she has had a number of health challenges over the years, but she is still hanging in there, and she's feisty and she's energetic. But you know, a lot of them have gotten up in age, and Val is, I think, 88 now.
Yeah. I talked to her about a month ago. The questionnaire asked if she's still making art. I don't know that she is, but I would like to report that, like Pemon said, she was very energetic and she sang to me. So if that counts.
So it's interesting when you say, is she still making art? Because I would assume that meant theater. However,
that's what
she has made one of the most incredible quilts that traces her exposure and you know, because she worked with everybody from Maya Angelou to her and Ruby Dee. I mean, she goes down the line and has traveled all over the world. So she made quilts out of all of the t-shirts, and she got samples from different people, and it's really an incredible quilt. So she might not be doing theater right now, but she is still doing art.
You know what I wish I had put in there? Jennifer Girard, who went with me to Val's house to do the interview and took the photographs that you saw, took a picture of her wrapped in that quilt, and it really is a great picture. I should send it to you.
Yeah, it's great.
Other questions, Daddy?
Yes. Are there any Latino or Asian theater companies?
Yes, both. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the Latino theater company, and I really think it's a great. What's the name of it?
Teatro Vista is one,
and they're great.
And
yeah. You know, I told my doctor at one point that I had developed a new disease, and he asked me what, and I said, well, you've heard of restless leg syndrome? And I said, well, I have bad play restless leg syndrome, because every time I went to see a play that was bad, my legs would hurt. If the show was good, they wouldn't bother me at all. But whenever I went to see that production company, I loved everything I saw them do. And so, yeah, so they were there. I think that they're in Chicago, out of the 250 theaters, almost every group is represented in some way. And I think that that's going to be one of the detriments of people surviving, because what you end up with is you have a theater for every cause, you have a theater for every group, and so some of them are going to have to pull together so that it makes more economic sense for the whole.
There's also something called the Rasaka Theater that's Indian based too.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of things.
Yes, a lot of theaters.
Okay, so our last question, it's in the form of several questions, but related to the same topic. Where are the new plays coming from? Are there new playwrights and opportunities for their works to be seen? And can new works be produced as easily as they were in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s?
Okay, I'm going to answer the last part first. No. When we were producing in the 70s and 80s, we were producing because we were trying to learn the craft, and also because we wanted to serve. But you have a lot of theater companies that are charging professional prices in their community theaters, and they need to learn the process before they get paid a hefty salary. As a person that makes movies and TV, I also have a major concern for how plays are being written, because a lot of them are being written for television, because the writers really want to get work in TV and film. And so you see the essence of how the film, or how the play is constructed, as if it's going to be a sequel, or the storylines are cut where they don't clarify what the play is about, because all they're trying to do is sell it. And I have hated the ending of maybe 60% of the plays I see, because it's almost like people get to page 80 and say, okay, well, that's enough pages, I'm done. So I think that the challenge is going to be, how do you keep people writing specifically for theater when you have all of this money attracting them to television and to film? Can we really sustain the theater community where they're not going to be making all this money, and you're doing it out of the heart and love for the theater? And so I think that that's going to be one of the challenges. Finally, there has to be more. I'm sorry, go on.
I was going to say, one of the things I wrote to Mark earlier today was the fact that the early growth of theater in Chicago seemed to me to be dependent on groups of individuals who were getting together, doing something they loved, rather than writing for a specific storyline or a specific purpose, or to fill seats in a specific building, or to have sets or costumes or whatever. In other words, it was an individual endeavor. And I was wondering if this whole current situation might bring a rebirth of Chicago theater back to that focus.
Well, I hope so. I opened the La Manzino Theater in 1973. Around the same time, the Steppenwolf opened, and Organic, and the Apollo, and we were all on the initial committee for the formation of the League of Chicago Theaters. We were the original board members, and all of us, and if you look at all of those institutions, they were built around people that really were just trying to get some work done. They wanted to be creative. And, when we opened our first theater, I think we charged $2.50 for seats. $5 was the max. And we gave away a lot of them because we really were more interested in the audience than we were in making money. And I think that was one of the issues that we should have faced, because we should have understood the economics of it. And I don't think that a lot of us did.
Before we go, I'd also like to drop some names of young playwrights that I think are very exciting in finding all kinds of opportunities. Ike Holter, I think, is on fire, and his plays have been performed all over the city before this, of course. Philip Dawkins is doing a lot of stuff. Isaac Gomez, and his plays are being produced around the country, as are Ike Holter's. Sandro Delgado is doing some astonishing stuff. And they're all finding places to do it, So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff going. Those are just the names that just first came to mind.
Yeah. And so I guess the new challenge is going to be, how do you sustain a community? And is there a way to keep artists in Chicago? Can we begin to look at how we do that in a way that you don't lose your best talent to California, to New York, as soon as they're developed, or you don't lose the best plays, So I think we have a lot of work to do about building an infrastructure that will allow people to be sustained here.
Anything else? All right. We've sort of gone over time.
Yeah. And
well, this has been an amazing evening, and I want to thank Mark and Pemon for joining us tonight. This is the kind of thing we hope for, and anyway, it has been wonderful. We thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Pemon. Thank you so much for all that you contribute. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, it is past most of our bedtimes tonight. So thank you everybody who attended. And I just want to say that we do have a very interesting program coming up for our October meeting, October 19th. And they say the third time is a charm. Our author will be Carlo Rotella. His book is The World is Always Coming to an End, Pulling Together and Apart in the Chicago Neighborhood. This is a book about the South Shore neighborhood from 1967 to the present. We originally scheduled Carlo in March, which of course we had to cancel. And then we had him scheduled for July, which due to technical difficulties, we had to cancel. So now, for the third time, we hope is a charm. He will be back in October. Otherwise, the world will come to an end, I think. But anyway, so that's our next book club meeting. Thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you.
And I wish you all a good evening.
It was a great evening.
Good night,
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.